Did the Saudi crown prince order the killing of Jamal Khashoggi? Did Elizabeth Warren's DNA test backfire? Will Canada's experiment with legal marijuana be a success? And find out what the media didn't cover in our most underreported stories of the week. I'm Heather Godwin, and this is The Square Circle. Hello, and welcome to The Square Circle. I'm your host, Heather Godwin. Joining us today are Stephenie Foster of Smash Strategies, conservative commentator Valerie Greenfeld, and Kat Murti of Feminists for Liberty. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nice to have you ladies here. This week, it has become clear that Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi was killed by Saudi agents in Turkey 2 weeks ago. NBC News picks up the story from there.
King Salman had denied knowing anything about the missing journalist, President Trump seeming to buy his explanation.
I don't want to get into his mind, but it sounded to me like maybe these could have been rogue killers. Who knows?
But NBC News has learned from 3 sources that Saudi leaders are now discussing a plan to admit Khashoggi was killed there. One says it was during an interrogation that went wrong.
So, Stephenie Foster with Smash Strategies. What needs to happen next?
Well, I think a couple things. I mean, this is just a horrible story. I think we all now seem to agree across the aisle, across the world, that this journalist was killed in the consulate in Istanbul. So I think, however, we need to do a couple of things. One is really a very independent investigation to ensure that we understand the facts. Right now the Saudis and the Turks are doing an investigation together. It just doesn't seem like we're really going to get to the bottom of this if the Saudis are actually investigating something that they were involved in. We saw footage where cleaning crews went into the consulate right before the investigators got there. So these are really things that are very troubling. I think the next question, though, is then what do we do on a policy level? And there are a couple of things that Congress can do and the president can do. There can be sanctions against people who are on the Magnitsky list, which it's called. They can freeze bank accounts, look at how to look at arms sales in a different way. Yes, of course, we sell a lot of arms to the Saudis, but we don't have to sell quite as many. There's a lawsuit the Saudis don't like that harkens back to 9/11. So there are a lot of things that really are on the table as far as a policy response. And I think it's really, however, first important to get to the bottom of what happened and understand what culpability the government of Saudi Arabia has, if they have it. I think they do, but I'm going to say if they have it.
And Valerie Greenfeld, what's your point of view?
I appreciate the way that you made your statement because, we don't know what happened yet, and there's no guilt until it's been completely investigated. On the other hand, loss of life is always taken seriously, as you stated. But I think the Middle East is such a complicated place, and the United States, as you stated, the Saudi Arabia buys $450 billion a year from us, and they need us more than we need them. So we do have the level of ahead of them. On the other hand, they are helping us with Iran. They're helping Israel. They're doing a lot of business with Israel. And so the chessboard is very, very complicated at this time. And so I think, Trump right now is being very careful and taking step by step slowly to find out what are the facts first. But as you said, there are many different ways that we can make them accountable should we have to do that.
And Kat Murti with Feminists for Liberty, what's your opinion?
Yes, thank you. This is a disturbing case, but it's certainly not one that stands on its own. We've seen repeated cases of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia finding dissidents who are living outside of Saudi Arabia, and one way or another they end up in body bags or in prisons back in Saudi Arabia. This has been a common pattern. The reason that this is getting attention is because Khashoggi was slated to start working at the Wilson Center here in Washington, D.C. He is a journalist for The Post, so he was a known name amongst Western media. And, you know, as awful as this case is, and as much as I mourn for his family, in some ways, this gives Americans an opportunity to understand how dangerous our so-called alliance with Saudi Arabia is. We look at this as something that's keeping stability in the Middle East, but it's not clear that it is. It is clear that Wahhabism that has been funded by Saudi Arabia has played a key role in terrorism, both within the Middle East and outside. And quite frankly, our major ties to them are both because of arms sales that we're not profiting that much from, and much more so because of their opposition to Iran. I think that the U.S. government is going to not want to cut ties, particularly at this point when we're looking at making sanctions on Iran in the first week of November, oil-related sanctions that we're hoping that the Saudi government will back us up on. But overall, I think that this is a dangerous alliance, one that is not benefiting us, and this is the time to really start looking at why we view them as an ally when they're by no means, we don't share the same values, and they're creating a lot of danger in the world.
I disagree. I agree that the Wahhabi ideal is a problem. I agree that actually that Jamal was part of a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is, as you said, is a big problem. But I think Saudi Arabia is giving the Middle East an opportunity to get away from Iran. Many, like the Israelis are now coming together with Saudi Arabia, and I think to give them a chance to get away from Iran and all of the problems that Iran is causing Israel is a huge, huge deal, and it also could have an opportunity to lead to peace, to some kind of peace agreement.
I don't think that the Saudis are the key to peace. What I do think is true is that this is a very complicated chessboard in the Middle East, and I think that as the U.S. continues to get more and more involved, it becomes more complicated and more dangerous, and that's something that we need to seriously consider.
Stephenie, having worked in the State Department, what choices do you think the government really has?
Well, I mean, obviously diplomacy goes on both publicly in terms of public statements that get made and behind the scenes. I think one thing, and I would agree it's a complicated world, we all know that in that neighborhood. Again, looking at ways to, are there going to be sanctions lists? Is that something that gets enforced against people who were involved in this killing? Are there going to be ways to really temper the arms sales? I mean, the largest arms sales actually to Saudi Arabia happened in the Obama administration. So it's not as though having a tough conversation and really showing our muscle perhaps, it means you don't sell them arms. I mean, I think we need to be very clear about that. President Obama was certainly a proponent of human rights in the region. So I think those are things that we need to think about. I also think that it's one thing we need to ensure we have an ambassador to Saudi Arabia who's confirmed by the Senate and an ambassador to Turkey who's confirmed by the Senate. Right now we don't have those people, and our foreign policy is being conducted by, as far as I can tell, at a high level, Jared Kushner, and I think that is not really helping the situation move forward. I think we need to be very clear about that we use diplomats who are very seasoned in a very complicated world.
Thank you. All right. I'd like to remind our viewers that you can submit your questions to our guests through our website, www.publicsquare.net, or via Facebook or Twitter, and we'll answer as many as we can on air live towards the end of the show. Also this week, Senator Elizabeth Warren attempted to quiet the ongoing controversy over her Native American heritage, but she may have made matters worse. Here's the story from CBS News.
In a series of early morning tweets, President Trump called Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren phony and a complete and total fraud, continuing his frequent attacks on Warren's assertion that she's part Native American.
They call her Pocahontas.
Pocahontas! Pocahontas!
Today, Mr. Trump cited criticism by the Cherokee Nation, saying even they don't want her. The tribe denounced Warren's decision to take a DNA test as inappropriate and wrong, and said she's undermining tribal interests.
Valerie Greenfeld. Why is this important?
Well, I think it's interesting that Elizabeth Warren chose 22 days before the election to make this kind of announcement, and I think that she's obviously hoping that it would go the other way. I do believe that it backfired quite badly on her. The Cherokee Nation also made some comments about, that because you take a DNA test does not mean that you are part of a tribe. It's something that you're born into, and many people still live on that the land or the reservation that their ancestors lived on, and to say that a DNA test creates that she's now become a part of the tribe is really a false kind of advertising for an election or for perhaps to get into a university.
What's your opinion, Kat Murti?
Blood tests in order to decide who can run for office, who can hold positions. I mean, the new racism sounds an awful lot like the old racism to me. I mean, it's a difficult situation. Certainly, President Trump's comments on this have been flagrant and offensive, but Elizabeth Warren's response was not so good either. And honestly, I do side with the Cherokee Nation on this. The fact that the senator has somewhere between 1/64th to 1 out of 1,024 chance of having Native American blood that cannot be tied to the Cherokee Nation by no means makes her Cherokee. It's the lived experience of being a Cherokee. And I think that looking at things in this way can be very detrimental. And I think we need to look at why this claim even came to be combated, and it's because of affirmative action. She had used her heritage, which is something that she can be proud of. If her great-grandmother was Cherokee, there's no reason that she should denounce that. That said, that should not get her a special seat reserved for her. And those kinds of distinctions that we make do encourage this sort of race-baiting talk, this kind of discussion, this kind of idea that what's in your blood and what's in your DNA should qualify or disqualify you from having positions, and it shouldn't. It should be merit-based.
Mm-hmm. Stephenie Foster, what do you think?
Well, I mean, I think this is, it's kind of just a weird story to me. I mean, and I would agree with a couple of things that have been said, but disagree with others. I mean, there is no real evidence that somehow the fact she said she was Native American had an impact on her getting jobs. There have been interviews and with all these people who've hired her over the years at law schools, and I mean, and at my law school, in fact, she was a professor not when I was there, and I know they have very stringent standards about who they hire. So, I mean, the part about what impact this had on her, on her ability to get a job, I don't really see that as an issue, but I feel like we're kind of in a weird world where we have the President of the United States calling her Pocahontas and this blood test. Personally, I just find it to be kind of a distasteful story.
Mm-hmm. Well, then I go back to my initial question. Why is this important? Why does this necessarily matter?
Well, because she's planning to run, we are assuming she's planning to run for president, and this is a positioning tactic that is used on both sides of the aisle to, prepare for who's going to be on top, who's going to be the last Mohican, so to speak, that's left.
Yeah, I think this is all about what's going to happen in the next elections.
Okay, and finally, our neighbors to the north have embarked on a major social experiment. Here's coverage from Fox 47 in Michigan. 3, 2, 1.
And with that countdown, it was official.
Here's your receipt. The first legal receipt issued in Canada.
Canada goes green, as in pot. The U.S.'s northern neighbor is now the second country after Uruguay to legalize and regulate marijuana. Canada is also the first G7 nation to make this move.
Kat Murti, what do you think of all this?
I am extremely excited. Congratulations to Canada. Congratulations to their activists. This is a long time coming. Canada is now the second nation in the world, 193 left to go, to legalize adult recreational cannabis following Uruguay. And it's the largest country. They're not going to run into some of the same problems that we've seen in Uruguay or in the states in the United States that have legalized recreationally, because they've run into problems with the dollar standard because the U.S. federal government still has cannabis listed as a controlled substance and does not recognize the legal status, whether within the United States or in countries that use dollarization. Legal businesses are not able to access the legal banking system. So despite the fact that legalizing cannabis does make society overall safer, forcing people to essentially black market their money and to operate only in cash is hurting us. I'm really hoping that the U.S., where the majority of Americans support legalizing cannabis and where the majority of Americans now live in recreationally legal states, will be number 3 and soon.
And Stephenie Foster, what do you think of all this?
Well, I doubt we'll be number 3 and soon, because I just think this is the kind of issue that probably moves to the forefront now. But I think, I think it's fine. I think that a lot of people will be able to, go and buy cannabis at stores that are more regulated, where it's easier for them to get it. They'll know what the, portion size is or whatever. And I think it's fine. I think it's probably past due, and it wouldn't be a bad thing if it happened here. I just don't see it happening anytime soon.
And Valerie, what do you think?
Well, I'm from Colorado.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I agree with both ladies.
The poster child.
I think, it's something that, especially for medical marijuana, there are many people that are using this for pain, and it's something we've really needed for a very long time. I have no problem with it whatsoever.
Well, you mentioned what happened in Uruguay. I'm not familiar with that. Can you share what happened in Uruguay?
Yes, absolutely. They were the first country to legalize a couple years ago, and so it's a smaller country. It's overall been positive. They've seen a lot of positives come out of it. Their negatives have largely been on the basis that they're not able to have a banking system. So the same problems that we've seen in places like Colorado, Washington, California, they're saying there in Uruguay. Canada is not going to have those same problems because, of course, they use the Canadian dollar. Now, where they might have potential issues is U.S. Border Patrol has already said that they might be blocking Canadians coming into the United States who admit to using legal cannabis in Canada. Activist Mark Emery, who was instrumental in this win in Canada as well, served several years in the United States as a Canadian citizen operating a business that was legal in Canada, however, being extradited by the United States. So I think that we're still going to face some problems in those kinds of things. The larger message, though, is that the harms of drugs are extremely enhanced by the war on drugs. And this whole set of detrimental policies that promote violence, that promote harmful drug use, needs to end. And I think that Americans as a whole understand this, and it's time that our government catches up with it.
Well, I know that one of the things that the war on drugs has done is it has created a lot of jobs. And so that makes me wonder if, that's got to be some hesitation. It's going to dismantle entire industries if we lose that.
Well, one thing, and not to respond to that, I do think this whole issue of making sure that as entrepreneurs are starting and running these stores, that they're able to do so in a way that allows them to be safe. And we were talking before about the fact that, a lot of the stores, or all of them here in the U.S., have big security guards standing outside and inside because they're worried about having so much cash on hand. So I think that goes to your point of just it's not creating or creating a system that is safe on a lot of levels. It's about the drugs being, probably better regulated, and also making sure that on a level of, crime, right, that there's not a lot of cash sitting around for someone to take. So I think that's also an interesting issue.
So if the United States were to follow this model, where do you think they would start?
I think we start with federally removing cannabis from the Controlled Substances Act. It needs to be deregulated. It's currently a Sector 1 substance. It's considered technically more dangerous than cocaine, which has a medical use on the federal level in the U.S., but cannabis does not. So we need to remove it from there, and we need to go back to a federalist model and let states decide for themselves.
And also there are certifications that have to be done in order to sell, whether for medical reasons or not. One of the problems that we've had in Colorado is when they put cannabis in food. And, children have had, it's a cookie or something like this, there's one on the road. Yes, so something like that, we need much more research, and so that people will, when they buy something like that, they know exactly what's in it and the strength of it, so that they can prohibit problems with kids.
A lot of that research, unfortunately, has been blocked by the federal government. And so the federal government getting out of the way of people trying to make things safer for Americans and for the world at large, I think is the path forward.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess the biggest question is, why are we stalling? Why is this moving so slowly?
Well, I think you came back to it on some of it. There is certainly a lot of people who are making money off of drugs being illegal in this country. Now that's green market jobs, gray market jobs, and black market jobs. Black market level, obviously the cartels, illegal elements, they're able to thrive because this is illegal. Just as we saw under prohibition of alcohol, the rise of the mafia. Under prohibition of cannabis and other such drugs, we've seen the rise of cartels in the United States. But we also have the prison lobby and the pharmaceutical lobby and the alcohol lobby that are really fighting tooth and nail to keep cannabis illegal, as well as, unfortunately, some folks who are in the gray market states where they're medically legal and they've established a business and they don't want to compete with new people coming into the market. So I think just really stepping aside and understanding that all of those competing interests are holding us back and making people a lot less safe would be worth really looking at.
I think it's worth saying that a lot of, states have, made these decisions by referendum and popular vote. So I think even though it seems like we haven't moved quickly, I think, really in the last 10 years, there's been a tremendous amount of movement in this country in terms of referenda. And I'm always surprised by that. I'm from California where we love referenda. So I'm really familiar with that. But I'm surprised by how many states, have either medical marijuana or they have recreational marijuana, and it's usually through citizen referenda. So I think there has been movement, but not at the federal level.
I'm glad you brought that up because where we are now compared to where we are 20 years ago, leaps and bounds. That's when we first started seeing medical. Now we're seeing again over half of the U.S. population lives in states where recreational cannabis is legal, and the majority of Americans support completely legalizing it. So the people are there. Our politicians are dragging their heels because of special interests, and it's time we held their nose to the fire.
Yeah, it's time for the federal laws to be changed.
We'll see how our neighbors affect our country. All right, well, let's take some questions from our viewers. Ramona Young. If Warren runs for president, will this issue come back to haunt her? Well, I think we have discussed that to some extent, but who would like to take that question?
I really just don't think she's going to run anymore. I think this has really caused a lot of problems for her. She's lost a lot of credibility. People are saying she was dishonest. There are a lot of problems that has been created by this, and I think the timing made it even worse because she's under the microscope because of the elections that are coming up.
I would say a couple things. The election for president is 3 years away, right, or 2.5. A lot happens, and there's a lot of things that get people consider when they're considering who to vote for. I do think we're in an era where things that I thought mattered a long time ago, or even 3 years ago, don't seem to matter to voters as much. So I'm not disagreeing that it could matter to voters. It's so hard to know now. Just because obviously the person who was elected president has, in my view, said things I'm surprised a presidential candidate, let alone, person who becomes president, can say publicly. So I think it's a different time.
I agree with you, and I think the Kavanaugh hearings was a real good example of that, how, we're looking for a Supreme Court justice and we're not discussing, the cases that he's reviewed. We're talking about what his yearbook was in high school and all of these kinds of things. And I agree with you. We need to bring our country back up to the level of decency that we've lost.
I think it's clear that the reason that she took this test, that the reason that she created what is obviously a campaign ad, is that she's angling for the 2020 Democratic nomination. Mm-hmm. Now, it's worth mentioning that a poll taken soon after her ad was released and her test results became public knowledge show her only holding 8% of support. She's way behind of favored or expected candidates amongst the Democratic Party. She has 2 or 3 years before the election. There's going to be a little, or not even 2 years, but still, we've got some time. I think that the stories will change. This may or may not hold her back. It's clear, however, that this is her opening bid for president.
It is early yet. Okay, and next we have Herman Brock. Thank you so much for writing in. What did Khashoggi do or say that would make the Saudi regime want him dead?
Well, Al Jazeera said that he was a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, and the kingdom is clearly against the Muslim Brotherhood. And I believe as he was writing different opinion columns, he took a swipe or two at the monarchy itself, at the kingdom itself. And I think that's, you don't do that in a country that's not free like that.
Well, I think also, there's sort of a question about was he a member of the Muslim Brotherhood? Did he believe it? But I think what he really did is, and what you're saying is that, and we talked about it earlier, this is a country that, reformers don't kill their political opponents. This is a country where there have been other things that have happened to people who have protested or said something negative about the monarchy or actions. For example, at the same time women were granted the right to drive, then like 2 weeks later, women activists were detained by the government.
Who pushed for that were all suddenly somehow in prison.
Right. And so I think this is a country where there's not a lot of room for really pressing issues and criticizing the regime.
Okay, now it's time for the most underreported story of the week. And Kat Murti, we'll start with you.
Thank you. I'd like to talk about Senator Heidi Heitkamp of North Dakota, who earlier this week released a newspaper advertisement calling sexual assault and domestic violence survivors in North Dakota Prairie Strong. I think that this came from good intentions. Her Republican opponent said some truly disgusting things about survivors of sexual assault and suggested that women who would vocally talk about their assaults or who would comment on the Me Too movement were essentially not to be trusted and were more interested in fame than anything else. He's also made some very disturbing comments about what qualifies as rape. That said, in her advertisement, she included the names of survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence, none of whom were asked for their permission to have their names published in the newspaper. And there is something very disturbing about someone who's allegedly making the case for consent, not getting the consent of people that she's using to prop up her case.
A little ironic.
And so, yeah, it's ironic. And I think that it's really important as we continue the Me Too movement that we focus more on what consent means and building a safer world for everyone, male and female, not all sexual assault survivors are women. And we make sure that we don't overly politicize it and make it really about the policy and the issues and not about politics.
Great. Valerie.
I think one of the most underreported stories this week was some comments that Louis Farrakhan made. He's known to be an anti-Semite, and the quote he actually said was, "Call me a hater or an anti-Semite, but I say anti-termite." And that was really straight out of the Nazi handbook, to call Jewish people, an insect, and it's worse than anti-Semitic in my opinion.
I haven't heard his name in a while. That's interesting. And Stephenie.
Well, my story is very different. It was actually, again, on the front page of the Post, but underreported because of the crazy times we live in, that Russia is now, again, trying to work in Afghanistan, has really reached out to the Taliban. And this is very ironic, of course, as well, given their defeat 30 years ago there. But really looking at how Russia has started to assert itself as a regional power again in that part of the world.
All right. That's all for this week. I'm Heather Godwin, and thanks for watching The Square Circle. We'll see you next week.